Welcome to Mental Health Matters. Today we have three people from the Native American community in Oakland. I'm Janet King. I'm the project director of our Children's Mental Health Grant. I work at the Family Child Guidance Clinic, which is the mental health department of the Native American Health Center. And I'm joined to my right with Sheila Jumping Bull. She's one of our community members, and she utilizes the services at Native American Health Center. She's Lakota. She's been raised in Oakland and on her reservation in Pine Ridge. She's also one of our community advocates. She sits on the Ongoing Planning Council, which is the council that oversees the Mental Health Services Act programs through the Alameda County Behavioral Health Care Services. And to my far right is Martha Martinez. She also works with me at Native American Health Center. She's our cultural facilitator there. She is Lakota, and she is born and raised in Oakland. And so today we wanted to share with you some concepts of how we conceptualize mental health in the Native American community. And the first thing I want to share with everybody is we conceptualize mental health differently from mainstream mental health. We think of health as the balance between four different quadrants. And if I can refer to our medicine wheel here, we think of health as a balance between spirit, emotions, except we have feelings here, mind, which is thought on this graph, and body. And it's different from the mainstream way of thinking about mental health, because mainstream sometimes think of health as mind and body. But for us, we also think of it as being spiritual and emotional. So we think of health as having balance between those four quadrants. Also, when we say health, we also include mental health. We don't distinguish mental health and health. Like if we were, if a Native person was greeting another Native person, thousands of years ago before our culture became outlawed, a person wouldn't say, hey, how's your health? How's your mental health? They would just say, how are you? And you would incorporate those four quadrants that I spoke of: the spirit, the emotions, the mind, and the body. So the medicine wheel, is ancient, traditional, native. It's an ancient native tradition. It's not owned by Native American Health Center or any other entity. It belongs to all of us. It's rooted in culture, and it still serves us as a way to direct our services. So we have the medicine wheel incorporated into our model. And so this is our whole model that we use at the Native American Health Center. And it's the holistic system of care for Native Americans in an urban environment. And what I like about this model is, first of all, it's circular, it's not linear. And this is a traditional Native belief that things happen in cycles, they're not linear. And also, what I like about this model is it was drafted by our community and by our traditional advisors. So it wasn't just something that was thought of by providers or thought of by scientists in a laboratory. It was actually drafted by our community by having many meetings. And so the other thing I like about this model, again, it's not an individual profile of one person going through life. It's a collective profile of our whole Native American community. And it also takes into consideration our collective experience of responding to the genocide policies. So probably the most common denominator as a diagnosis for Native people is historical trauma. And historical trauma is, when we think of historical trauma, we think of all the responses that we're having to that history. And the responses, we call it historical trauma response. We have those listed in this outer circle here. So the responses to historical trauma is symptoms like, alcoholism, homelessness, poverty. So these are the symptoms of historical trauma. They're not actually the diagnosis of what's happening to us. And so also what I like about the model is that it doesn't stigmatize. All of us, providers, consumers, and family members, are all suffering from some form of historical trauma. Some have more severe symptoms than others. So it helps, deal with the stigma problem. At Native American Health Center, what makes us different from other clinics is that we value our traditional culture. We value, most of our best practices include culture. A long time ago, what kept Native people healthy was our cultural traditions. You did not have a chance to develop a low self-esteem and then eventually suicide if all of your customs and ceremonies were intact. What happened to us in the history of genocide was that our culture became outlawed. So our system of care, which our culture was, became outlawed, so we didn't have access to it anymore. And so our community members suffer from the loss of that culture, developed historical trauma symptoms. And what happens when there's untreated grief, unresolved grief, it just gets transferred to the next generation. Meaning, you know, even though I might not have been the one who was stolen from my mother and had to endure my whole childhood in a boarding school, you know, any of us in our community could be raised by that person who had that experience. And that grief is unresolved, untreated, it gets transferred to the next generation. So that's why it's real important for us to have a model that acknowledges that collective history. And we know what kept us healthy a long time ago was our traditions, our culture. And so when you look at our services array at Native American Health Center, you'll see a lot of traditional culture built in to those services because we know that's what makes us healthy, and those are the best practices for us to recover from historical trauma. And so I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Martha, and she's going to talk a little bit more about our traditional services.
At the Native American Health Center, one of the programs that we're developing is our traditional health program, and what we're doing with that is we're taking our Western medicine and bringing in and introducing on all our service levels, medical service, mental health services, and we're blending our culture in all those levels. In the past, we've done that, but it's been only in our behavioral health services, and now we're doing that across the board. One of the things that we know is that one of the greatest challenges for our urban Native community is access to our traditional practices and our cultural traditions. And so just due to a lack of resources, people aren't being able to make it home to our tribal homelands to access our traditional ceremonial practices and our traditional medicine people. And so by doing providing access through the Native American Health Center and our programs, then our urban community are able to come forward and have that piece of healing that we know is integral in terms of healing Native people. One of the things that we do is we provide access to our medicine people. We build relationships with a number of traditional people and medicine people. We bring them into our community and we set up appointment times. We call them traditional counselings, where our community members can come in and meet with them and ask the questions that they need and get that kind of dialogue with our medicine people. The other thing that we do is we have, I'm going to tell you a story. We had that opportunity, you know, when we were, we brought out a traditional medicine person from South Dakota. And we had, the first thing we wanted to do was ask our community, what is it that you need? And so we had a talking circle. And our talking circle went great, but it wasn't what happened in that talking circle. It was what happened between the dinner and the actual talking circle. And what we noticed is that families in our community kept pulling this medicine man aside and getting them into corners and talking about the trauma and grief that they've experienced living here in the urban setting. And so the next day he came back and he said, you know, we need to have a wiping of the tears ceremony. Wiping of the tears ceremony is an end of grieving ceremony. That's a traditional Lakota ceremony. And he said, what we need to do is we need to have it on a community level. So that's another example of the things that we're doing. We're taking these ceremonies that originally happened back in our homelands on the reservations, and we're translating them to an urban environment here in Oakland. And we're taking a family ceremony and we're translating it to a community setting. The most important part of what we're doing there is holding the integrity of that ceremony so that the core of what keeps us strong and builds our resiliency as Native people is kept intact. And so that's what we did. We had a wiping of the tears ceremony for the entire community to help them let go of some of that unresolved grief and unresolved anger that you talked about, that's a result of historical trauma, and all of these built up symptoms of the years, of some of which we experienced in this generation, but some that go back through our parents and our grandparents' generations.
Sheila Jumping Bull, would you like to share your experiences accessing some of our traditional services at Native American Health Center?
Yeah, one of the most important things to me being, I guess if you know, would call it a consumer of the Native American Health Center, was actually being able to have a naming ceremony for my daughter. And the reason why I wanted to do that is because I wanted her to have a part of me to carry on, especially if she's going to grow up in an urban environment. So being able to have a medicine man come out who is my tribe and actually give my daughter her name was a really good feeling for me, because I felt like I did something that I was taught to do growing up. And her name, how it came about is she's mixed tribe, and her father's actually a California native, so he's Pomo, and I'm Lakota Sioux from Pine Ridge Reservation. So the medicine man gave her a name that actually came from my tribe but honors her father's tribe. So it was a really good thing for me. Kind of felt good to be culturally active in the urban society. Being a Native American, that's really hard to do. Yeah.
So we're really lucky at the Native American Health Center to have naming ceremonies. And at first, when you first hear of it, you know, the Western mental health service system, they wouldn't think of a naming ceremony as a mental health intervention. So one of the things that we also do at Native American Health Center is work with our partners to understand how our interventions are related to the mental health needs that we have. And one of the mental health needs that we have is, you know, we suffer a lot from isolation, which is known to the mental health field to be a risk factor for severe mental illness. And the isolation is something, you know, just because you're the only Native person sometimes in your classroom, sometimes the only Native person in your whole school, you could be the only Native person at your job. And what's anxiety provoking for that is that a lot of Native values are actually sometimes the opposite of Western values. So you're operating on a daily basis, living in a way that's opposite to how you would really like to function. So when we have events at Native American Health Center, we provide a respite for our Native community members to be together and to be in a place for the duration of that event where Native values are the norms. And so you can actually like relax and be around other Native people and know that you're in a mix of people who are, you know, validating how you believe. So our community events is also, our traditional services is part of our service array that we've spent a long time, you know, helping our mainstream and the health system understand. And then community events too, you know, it's not, at first thought, you wouldn't think of that as a mental health intervention, but for Native people who are suffering from isolation on a daily basis, it really is a mental health intervention.
Amazing. I remember the day of Rukaya's naming ceremony, how happy those children are getting those names. And, you know, we've talked about it a lot, of the importance of of our children recognizing each other across the room. When we live in a multi-tribal, multi-ethnic, very urban area, and so one of the challenges of serving Native people is that we don't have a neighborhood. There's not a place we can go. And we don't have a neighborhood because that was the intention when the relocation program started. It was a government-sponsored program to move Native people off the reservation to urban areas and to assimilate us into mainstream culture. And so that's one of the results, is that was very successful. And so one of the challenges as we recognize our community is to really know, help our children know other Natives in a very urban and diverse environment. And we want our children to recognize other children and youth across the room, and recognize them as other Native youth, and have a strong identity to being American Indian and Native. Because if we don't, then we lose them to the gangs. Because what they really need is that cultural identity, and that's what the naming ceremony and the grieving ceremony and the coming of age ceremonies, all of these things, powwows, that's what they bring forward, is that they can recognize each other.
And then I feel like the naming ceremony is a proactive way to prevent suicide, because naming ceremonies is suicide prevention intervention. But again, the mainstream wouldn't think of that. And Sheila, do you feel comfortable talking about how you feel like the naming ceremony is, you know, setting your daughter up for having a healthy life?
Yeah, it's part of her culture and it's part of her history, and it'll probably make her feel like she's really has a spirit of her ancestors in her, you know, because then she could say, I don't only have a so-called, you know, white man name, you know, I have my traditional name. And so I think it'll make her feel that more empowered to be part of an urban society, you know, an urban community, but yet she still has that traditional background, also with her dancing, you know, because to me, I want her to know as much as she can about our tribe, and I want her to be outspoken about it and to let everybody know about natives and what we've been through and what we've overcome and the struggles and the tears and the laughs and, you know, the heartaches and everything else that comes along with it. Because that's what me being on the OPC, that's what I do, is I have to explain to all these people with degrees and all these thoughts and labels about Native Americans. I have to go in there swinging, because it's just me being the only Native American on the board that constantly goes, it's just me, and I have to get it out there that Native Americans, we're Native Americans, we're no different than anybody else. We have our own beliefs, but yet we're always the last on the table to get or recognized even. So I just feel like it is a struggle every day to be a Native American, and it's hard, but in the end we're always still standing, still teasing each other and chauffeuring each other around. So yeah. Yeah, so I just feel like we know in the Native community what's a good, important resilience factor for our community members is to have a sense of identity. And that was what was attacked by the genocide policies, was to take our identity away as Native people. And probably our most important resource that made us healthy was being a Native American person, having all our ceremonies intact, having a strong sense of identity. You know, we're known, you know, nationally, Native Americans are known for having a high suicide rate. That high suicide rate is a result of having our culture not being available to us. It's not because we're Native American. And that's another thing that we understand very well at Native American Health Center. Everything that we're responding to is exterior to us. There's no flawed Native American DNA. And I know a lot of Western approaches to mental health and physical health, they'll look for the flawed DNA, what makes you respond this way. And what makes us respond the way we're doing is, again, having our culture taken away from us. You know, even something like diabetes, you know, we don't have a DNA that makes us susceptible to diabetes. What makes us susceptible to diabetes is not having access to our traditional diets. You know, having to become dependent on the kinds of foods that the federal government gave to us in exchange for our land, which are, you know, white flour, sugar, lard, salt, you know, all the makings for a diabetic community. So again, those are the things that we understand at Native American Health Center when we advocate for our community, is we know there's nothing wrong with the way we are. We're suffering from an approach to our health that's not right. And the approach to our health is, again, reclaiming our culture.
It's a huge part of it. It's a huge part of it, because not only do we find them and develop the language to tell the story, but we also at the same time develop that same, maybe you could call it a repatterning for our community to re-own and reclaim that identity. So one of the biggest challenges is not only developing the language to tell our story, but also to have tools within our community to reclaim that culture. You know, when some of the systematic genocidal policies that were perpetuated on Native people really affected self-esteem and has that, and directly, you know, feeds that unresolved grief and anger. And so how do we heal that? When you take all of the children out of a society, and what does that do? And in our cultures, our children were very, very sacred. What does that do to the mental health of the people? And how does that affect us? So when you look at diabetes, that there's that wonderful series, Unnatural Causes, that does a great job of tying in the historical components of the environmental changes that went on, how the water was taken away, and they specifically look at the Tohono O'odham people, and how the water was taken away, and how that environmental change made them more dependent on government commodities, the flour, the wheat, the lard. It wasn't until 1997 that they actually had fresh produce in that 1997, fresh produce in that government-sponsored program that still goes on today on our reservations. So it's not a lack of knowledge. It's a changing of the system that really helps. And when you look at that kind of a diet and you find a whole population that's dependent on that diet, that teaches a way of eating that gets translated through the generations, we have to, as a health center, figure out how to change those eating patterns now. But specifically address the anger and the grief that comes with them. And for Native peoples, that's one of our biggest challenges, is doing all of that rolled into one at the same time.
And I like what you said too. It's not a lack of knowledge. Another thing, sometimes I feel like the medical profession, and again the mainstream mental health profession, will act like it's a lack of discipline. That's why your life isn't together.
Yeah.
And I think that's the wrong message to give to Native people. I like the way Richard Muskamp, when he talks about this, he talks about how, it was basically illegal to be a Native person.
Mm-hmm.
It was especially illegal to be a Native man. And so when you can't even be yourself, you're setting yourself up for a lot of mental illness. And when you look at our traditional ceremonies, you had to have a lot of discipline to get up every day at sunrise, do things in correlation with the season. You had to have a lot of discipline. So it's not a lack of discipline that says our lives are in the chaos that they are. The Native people have a lot of discipline. Again, it's the exterior kinds of pressures that have been put on Native people, which you will never learn about if you do a DNA study. I don't think we need another DNA study.
No, I don't think so.
We need models, interventions, and we need the mainstream to understand and incorporate our history into treatment modalities. And again, that's what I think we do really well at Native American Health Center. We have interventions that take that collective history into consideration. And we're not blaming Native people for being in the conditions that they're in. We're amazed that they've survived and are still here given that history.
And we're taking that discipline that we learn in the ceremonies, and we're translating that back now to help us make those lifestyle changes. And that's what I really see happening now when I see us naming our children. Because right now what we're seeing, particularly in those naming ceremonies, is that we're seeing in our last ceremonies, I think it went from age 58 to 1 year. And historically, the ceremonies were only we named our babies. But because we had several generations that weren't named, particularly in urban areas, probably for the next couple of years, we'll see a wide age range of people that we give names to. And then maybe we'll go back to only naming our babies, because we'll have access to those ceremonies, and they'll have them from the beginning. And in that same way, we can use the discipline that we learn in these ceremonies to maybe have compliance with taking medication, or compliance with eating green, or things that actually serve us in terms of total health when we look at total health. So I think you're right when you say our traditions and our cultural ways, they had a way of working together that kept it all in balance. And it was that unbalance that got us to where we are today. And finding those things again will help us be healthier overall.
Yeah, one thing too that I feel like helped was the wiping of the tear ceremony, because there was a lot of our youth that we had lost, and a lot of kids were being, targets of gangs and stuff like that. And so I know that from a couple youth, that it helped, and the naming ceremony, it helped me because there was a lot of anger issues that I had with the OPD and with the, just everything that was going on, and being, labeled as a Mexican, people speaking Spanish and stuff. It's not easy growing up in urban, being Native American and growing up in urban society, but yet it's even harder to grow up on a res because, I mean, when you're out here, you can be who you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're on the reservation, you have to be traditional. You have to, do this and that. And sometimes I feel like we need to bring the values that are taught on the reservation and the ceremonies and stuff. We need to put it even, just like sock it to our youth even harder.
Mm-hmm.
That way they learn. That way they can know who they are. And I always tell them, instead of trying to be claiming this gang or that gang, why don't you start a drum group? Why don't you start a dance group? Why don't you start a Big Sisters Big Brother club?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. Because I just feel like a lot of our youth and our elders are forgotten about. Because the youth, people say they don't listen, they're troublemakers and stuff like that. And then they say the same thing about the elders, well, that elder's stubborn, or you can't tell them nothing and stuff like that. So I just feel like a lot of these ceremonies help our youth, and it helps them to really sit down and think, do I really want to be doing what I'm doing, or should I be going down this way? So, yeah.
And again, I think what you're talking about, Sheila, is what's most important about Native culture. It didn't discriminate against age.
Mm-hmm.
And our ceremonies and our gatherings and our teachings involved everybody of every age. And I'm bringing this up because I know this is one of the challenges that we have, interfacing with the mainstream and how, they'll want to separate us. Well, here's mental health interventions from 0 to 5, and here's mental health interventions for transition age youth, and here's mental health interventions for elders. And we don't really think of our community that way. We think of we have a holistic approach where we're taking care of our all. So again, I think reclaiming our culture is the best answer to restore the health to our communities that we once had before that culture was outlawed. Well, thank you for being with us here on Mental Health Matters, and I want to thank my community member, Sheila Jumping Bull, for being with us, and my co-worker, Martha Martinez, for being with us, and I'm Janet King. I want to say goodbye, and I forgot to mention my tribe. It's Lumbee. Good night.